Lords and ladies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good afternoon and a very warm welcome. My name is Mohammed Hinaydi. It is an honor to have you here with us for today's event hosted by the Extremist Monitoring Analysis Network, the acronym of which is EMAN, otherwise known as Faith in Arabic. This afternoon we are joined by prominent experts and public speakers who will be discussing a multitude of issues with respect to the current national security landscape in the United Kingdom. These issues include Islamist extremism, the rising threat of the far right, militancy, radicalism, and global threats to Britain. Before we begin, I would like to introduce myself and my organization, the EMAN Network. EMAN's objective is to address the rising threat of extremism, radicalism, fanaticism, and intolerance. These isms are primarily fueled by hate speech. We all have different definitions of hate speech, but hate speech, I believe, is a conveyor belt, and it leads to radicalism. Radicalism, in turn, leads to militancy, and in the worst cases, militancy can lead to genocide. So hate speech begins when certain individuals and organizations, be they a religious group or an ethnic group, believe that they are collectively superior to other ethnicities or other religions or other peoples. It is the epitome of the us versus them mentality. I founded EMAN because I truly believe that those on the fringes of society have been on the winning side for far too long. They represent a very, very tiny, minute population or portion of society. What you can see on the screen here is an example of some of these individuals that we have in our databases. We have picked 3 extremists just to demonstrate that, to demonstrate what we have. These extremists are all based in the United Kingdom. Saeed al-Ghamdi is a Saudi extremist. He's wanted in the kingdom on terror charges. We all know that Saudi Arabia has had a history in the past of radicalism within certain elements of its society and its clergy. This gentleman has said that Saudi Arabia is pursuing a policy of purifying its curriculum to make it more tolerant, more liberal, and to be accepting of other individuals and other religions. At the very end, he says, as if that's something that's bad, he says, soon Saudi Arabia will teach secularism, liberalism, and maybe Judaism. This man resides in the United Kingdom. He's basically been banished from Saudi Arabia and he's living here in exile. This person should not be able to say these things. He should not be living here. Abu Halim is someone who's been arrested recently in May 2021 here in the UK as well. He was a recruiter for Daesh, for ISIS. He's also been very vocally critical of clerics, Muslim clerics across the world that are considered moderate and liberal, ones in Australia, which is where I'm from. Abu Halima was arrested on drug charges, very Islamic, very pious. He was sentenced to 4 years in jail. The reason behind the sentence has nothing to do with drugs. He was commemorating the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in 2018, spreading terrorist propaganda. Katie Hopkins, a far-right personality in the UK. Katie, as many of you know, has said some outrageous stuff about Islam and Muslims. After the Nice attacks, a horrific terrorist attack in France, she said that Islam disgusts me. She has a large following, and also, although now her social media has been shut down, it's that sort of rhetoric that is really divisive. It's not just Muslims she's after as well. She was slammed by the Alzheimer's Society for disgraceful tweets where she labeled dementia sufferers as bed blockers and that they should be put to death. That is basically euthanasia. What this lady what she said in 2015 is what the Nazis practiced around 80 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to now introduce our speakers for today's event. We only have one, I promise you, not multiple ones. Julia Ebner from the University of Oxford joins us today to discuss the current state of white supremacism. Dr. Ebner has written books covering right-wing extremism and Islamism, including her latest book, Going Dark: The Secret Social Lives of Extremists. Nick Timothy, previously a policymaker at the Home Office, a former chief of staff at 10 Downing Street, is now a popular columnist at the Daily Telegraph and author of Remaking One Nation. Ed Husain joins us today. He's a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., has written multiple books on the threats of Islamist extremism in the UK, including his most recent book, Among the Mosques. Finally, Tom Tugendhat MP, our keynote speaker, will be discussing the global threats and challenges to Britain. Tom is chairman of the influential Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons. His analysis of Western policy failures in Afghanistan made global headlines last month. We are delighted today and honored to bring you a stellar panel of speakers. Upon conclusion of Tom's final address, we will open the floor to a discussion and a Q&A session amongst us all. Thank you, and I would like to now invite Julia.
I will focus on different trends that we're currently seeing on the white supremacist side of the spectrum, or on the far right end side of the spectrum. I do think this will be a very interesting discussion, as we have really different areas of expertise represented on the panel. So, as was briefly mentioned in the introduction, in Mohammed's introduction, I wrote the book Going Dark: The Secret Social Lives of Extremists, for which I went undercover with different extremist groups, and most of them were on the far right side of the spectrum. I also went undercover with jihadists, and with misogynist groups and conspiracy theory groups, which of course have a big overlap with far right extremists and white supremacists. What was interesting in these investigations that I did, so I was basically building up different fake identities online but also offline, and was recruited into their networks, but I could really find that there was a common pattern across all these different extremist groups. They were all going from recruitment to socialization. Socialization was really the most important step in the radicalization process. I would say even more important than the ideological indoctrination was this process of becoming a part of an exclusive subculture or of an exclusive community. And that was the case for all the extremist groups. And then there were communication campaigns and networking campaigns that were launched to network with like-minded individuals across the world. And of course, then sometimes this also ended in attacks. So there were these different stages in the radicalization process that I could spot. And now in the last just couple of years, we've of course seen that there has been a bit of a change in the landscape of extremism. And I want to briefly just give an overview of what my observations were in those last 2 coronavirus years, and then go to some of the trends that I would predict based on that, and based on my research. Hope Not Hate did a study and showed that there are actually 1 in 4 Britons currently that believe in QAnon-linked conspiracy theories. QAnon, for those who don't yet know it, is probably right now the worldwide biggest conspiracy theory community. They believe that basically all the people in Buckingham Palace are reptiles. I've just spoken to a QAnon sympathizer a couple of weeks ago on Parliament Square who told me that all the vaccinated people, have turned into hybrids. So we're half humans, half reptiles. And of course there are a lot of dimensions that add white supremacist ideologies to these conspiracy theories, because they would then blame, for example, the global Jewish elites for all of that. They would say, actually, it's them who started coronavirus, and they called it the plandemic. Do-it-yourself terrorism. This is already one of the last slides. I think I'm running out of time here. But this is again one of the future trends where we've already had a few cases of terrorists that have launched attacks based on printing their weapons with 3D printers, for example. The Halle attack in Germany did that. Or following bomb-making instructions that could easily be found on the surface web. You don't even have to go to the darknet to find that. So to sum up and to maybe come to a more positive conclusion, I do think we can tackle this threat, but I believe we have to really focus on a solution that looks both at early prevention, so really looks at internet citizenship, which doesn't just include digital literacy, but really digital citizenship and digital civil courage. So what does it mean to be an online citizen? And what does it mean if someone is attacked in front of me on the street? I would probably intervene, but we don't really see the same level of engagement and of intervention and of civil courage in the online space. And I think that really needs to be taught in an educational setting, that what does it mean to be a bystander if you see an online attack against a journalist, against a researcher, against a political activist. And intervention, again, I think we have lots of really good models of intervention and de-radicalization in the offline space, and we can still do a lot more to apply this expertise that we've gathered offline to the online spaces, to create outreach programs for some of these really darker platforms and darker corners on the internet. I'll leave it here and leave the rest for the discussion and for the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Before I start, I just want to say the database is very welcome. Having spent several years in the Home Office, it's a surprise to people on the outside that actually independent research and open source information and facts about some of these individuals, especially where it's in the kind of grey area of legality or illegality, is incredibly helpful. Although I suspect the civil service might ask you about whether it's GDPR compliant. It's very helpful to the people working there. As everyone here today knows, there is a battle going on around the world for the meaning and the heart and the soul of Islam. And to many people in this country, that battle is very complicated and even bewildering. There's the ancient split between Sunni and Shia and factions within those traditions. There are tribal rivalries and hostilities, autocracies, theocracies and democracies, states fighting proxy wars, countries sponsoring insurgents and terrorists, ministers who appear to report to their own intelligence agencies, whole regions that are lawless and beyond the control of their governments, and terror groups that are more powerful than the states where they reside. And there are even peace deals, and very welcome peace deals, between Israel and its former enemies in Arab states who realize their greatest danger comes not from a small democracy that is interested in living in peace and security, but a shared enemy in the form of the regime that governs the Islamic Republic of Iran. But to a country like ours, which is secular, increasingly agnostic and even atheistic, it's all very confusing. Among the followers of a religion many of us don't really know about or understand and read about only in the context of war and violence, there is a conflict between interpretations of the true faith, between scriptural literalism and modernity, between tradition and secularism, between allies of the West and Islamist enemies, and between indiscriminate violence and the rule of law. And sometimes, as we know, the violence reaches us here. We've seen bombs in London and Manchester, marauding attacks, the murder of a British soldier in London in broad daylight, and even an attack just yards away from here by the Houses of Parliament. And we've seen serious attacks of many kinds that have been thwarted thanks to the police and the intelligence services. And we've become almost inured to the violence. Following each successful attack, we have a short period of anguished conversation, but we soon return to normal. And the conversations are normally the same. So some raise economic or social exclusion, but the perpetrators are quite often educated and sometimes well off. Some raise our foreign policy, as though the extremism was caused by the wars of the last 20 years rather than the other way around. And some look to blame our imperial history, as though Britain uniquely is targeted for crimes we committed uniquely more than 100 years ago. We need authentic Muslim voices to develop and encourage ways of allowing Muslims to stay true to their faith, to lead good religious lives, but also to live in accordance with the values and traditions of the country they live in, and all the polling shows they're very proud to call home. So none of this is easy. It requires difficult truths to be confronted, and I cannot say enough how difficult it is for politicians to confront these truths. It's a complicated world, and one they find a little queasy. It requires them, politicians and government officials, to learn about things that they don't really know about and sometimes feel intimidated by. It requires much more than changing laws. It means changing hearts and minds. And it does also require help and support from friends and allies across the country, but beyond the country as well. But it is a hugely important task. At the moment, it feels quiet. We're not debating it at a national level, but we should be. And next time there's an attack, we will have the same sort of feverish debates for a few days. But for that reason, and for the reason of the enormous social damage that this is causing in communities up and down the country, regardless of the violence, it's a challenge we can't duck anymore. But it is a mission that we must all rise to.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it that you made time during a busy weekday lunchtime to be here to help launch EMAN. In summer of this year, Mo called me from Dubai and said, introduced himself, and I was struck by the fact that about 12 years ago we tried to do something similar in this country, but here was a young practicing Muslim from the silent majority, if you like, who put his own resources behind starting this organization. I can speak to you about the fact that there are, as Nick identified, over 1,000 mosques with connections to ideology linked to the Taliban's Deoband mothership. I can carry on talking about the increase in the far right and the other forms of extremism that Julia rightly identified. But I think all of that's too late. It's too downstream. And the real challenge for us isn't the silence of many, many British Muslim organizations on the Taliban, but what Leon Trotsky warned us, that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. So for all of us who don't want to talk about the extremism and the terrorism, who find it too uncomfortable to talk about brown fascists, i.e. Islamists, or are just too comfortable talking about the white Nazis but don't want to talk about Islamist extremism, the point is that we didn't choose this war chose us, whether it's the 1993 World Trade Center attacks, or whether it's 9/11, 7/7, and the range of attacks that keep following on since then, is that it is not the West and its Muslim allies and the vast majority of the Muslim world, and don't forget in countries such as Pakistan, the vast majority of the victims of terrorism are Muslims. So this is, as Nick correctly identified, not a clash of civilizations that puts Muslims against the West, but the vast majority of Muslims and others side by side with the West and the civilized world against the subversives. And in that, the forever wars or the clash of civilizations narrative, which I'll come to in a moment, comes from the other side. The gentleman, maybe the wrong word, gentleman, but the terrorist who committed the 7th of July terrorist atrocities here in London, talked about, Mohammed Siddiq Khan, MSK. You go online, look at the video. He was addressing his daughter, a child, and saying that, I'll see you in the next life. I'm sorry I won't be here for your birthday and seeing you grow up. He had a conviction of literalist belief in the afterlife that justified killing other people. And in that same belief, in a similar video, he then speaks to the rest of the country and in perfect Yorkshire English says, "You are at war with my people." How was it that a British subject, a British citizen, is declaring war against fellow Brits because he has an affiliation and an association with people in Iraq? it's a different world, and I want to explore that world a little bit with you through three things. Had it not been for the blood of the 6 million and more people that lost lives in the Holocaust, Muslims and others would not thrive here. And yet today we're seeing this leftist Islamist nexus on our campuses and elsewhere that is a real concern for the health of our nation. The third and the most important of the civilizational tests is how we treat women. This is, again, that's something unique to the Enlightenment and unique to the achievements of the West. It's not something that the Greeks or the Romans were able to achieve. And what we're seeing here across many Muslim communities in particular is that marriages are not registered in the legal sense. There's a Sharia court separatism at play, and more than 100,000 marriages at the moment are being conducted without them being safeguarded by the secular rule of law. Now, why is that a threat? It's a threat because women then want to break out of that marriage and they're told, oh no, you weren't married. That was just an arrangement. And then their divorce rights, their inheritance rights, and their access to wealth and inheritance is minimized. And that's a real concern. We can't let 5 million Muslims in this country have a different legal system based on Sharia on the grounds of law. A Muslim woman getting married in Israel, Afghanistan, and elsewhere comes here and she has full rights, but a British Muslim woman doesn't. And this is the country of the suffragettes. It's the country of Mary Wollstonecraft. This is the country that gave us female prime ministers. It's a country that's given us a Roman empress. It's a country that's given us monarchs and prime ministers who are female. We should not be afraid to say British Muslim women have full rights as equal citizens as everybody else, and we're not there yet. So women are the barometers, if you like, of the health of the rule of law in this country, and there's concern around those issues. Now, I end by saying that those three issues are the center of gravity because Islamists despise gender equality. Islamists despise pluralism that includes our Jewish forebears and our cousins. If it were not for the Jewish God, we don't have Christianity. If it's not for the Jewish belief in the one God, we don't have Islam. It's to that Jewish heritage that we own where we are, all of us today. And that's what they wish to cut, attack, undermine, destroy. So our national security depends on us going further upstream and understanding the center of gravity on which we stand and which our enemies wish to attack. And it's once we've reached that conclusion, I feel that then our responses will be different. Until we have that debate and are settled, we are constantly on the defensive, and this great country deserves to be better than on the defensive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I don't know about you, but I've heard a lot of speeches in my time, and I've given quite a few, but that was quite singularly the best I've heard in many, many years, and I'm incredibly privileged to have heard it. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to speak with you, because this question of extremism that we've been talking about this afternoon is one that, of course, has raised its head in the United Kingdom and indeed in many Western countries in various different ways, in ways that have challenged us and have forced themselves onto the front pages of our newspapers. It's really a fundamental question that has, in so many ways, changed our lives in the last 20 years, and particularly, as we remember, of course, at this time, 20 years ago, the 9/11 attacks that really did change our world, and for me, changed my life quite fundamentally, as it saw me sent from enjoying rather a pleasant life in the city of London to going and fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the reality is that what we've been hearing today is not a UK phenomenon, it's not a Western phenomenon, it's not American, it's not New Zealand, it is truly global. And I think it's worth putting into context where we sit and why the stability of the nation states that we rely on, the alliances that we depend on, have been so fundamentally challenged. And I thought I'd start off by talking about three things. The first is the liberal secular democracies that I was going to talk about, but frankly I have no need to because Ed has covered them so extraordinarily beautifully and rather more brilliantly than I ever could. And the fundamental challenges that we have in defending ourselves. The second is on the theocracies, those groups of nations, those groups of thoughts really, that challenge the Westphalian idea of the nation state, that really undermine the principles on which the liberal order that Ed just described is so fundamentally based, that idea of individual rights, that idea of the rights of a society that can rise in competition to, but also in partnership with neighbours. And the third is of the centralising authoritarian state. And I'm slightly surprised, but I'm going to bring up, I'm slightly surprised because I'm the first person to do it, but I'm going to bring up China in the third one. Because I think what we're seeing in a fundamental sense actually is a challenge of three different forms of governance, and three different ways in which human beings on the globe today are trying to understand the way in which the world works, our place within it, and the challenges that we all face. Because the truth is we're all facing very, very similar challenges that we're addressing differently. The first of them, of course, is globalization. I mean that not just in the sense that these microphones are probably made in China, that our clothes are probably made in places from Bangladesh to Huddersfield, that our, that our lives are absolutely fundamentally intertwined with droughts in Brazil and with rubber plantations around the world, and that very much all of the trade and the commerce that we're seeing affecting the UK economy at the moment, whether it's the gas price in Russia or whether it's the port blockages in the western United States or indeed in Felixstowe, are absolutely intertwined. Of course, that's part of it. Now, that is a pretty extraordinary situation to find ourselves in. And we have only found ourselves in that position because we have chosen it. We have chosen it because we have chosen to believe that the world that we have created is safe, is stable, and faces no risks. But that's why this group really matters and why I pay enormous tribute to you, Mo, for doing it. Because what you're doing is you're reminding us in a very visceral and very personal sense that the devil really does exist. Now, the devil that we've seen through Julia's slides is expressed in various faces. But actually, those faces aren't the faces that matter. The real faces that matter are the ones that Nick spoke about. Not the Hitlers and the Himmlers who stand at the front of the rally, but the millions and millions who cheer them on or silently allow them to walk past. And that is where the challenge for us all comes today. So I think there is a real possibility for a better future. I think there is a genuine hope for a different, stable, global outcome in which the work that Mo's doing, the work that many people here are doing, transforms not just a society, but actually a world into a more prosperous and peaceful and cooperative environment. But it is only possible if we do believe in a real future, not an immediate one, if we believe in justice, and of course, if we believe in cooperation. I don't think any of those are very difficult to achieve, but that none of them are possible without the first, which is belief. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to just applaud all our speakers for their wonderful insights and their words on a multitude of issues. I really want to sort of just focus on the concept of the Westphalian nation-state. Initially, it began, obviously, as many of you know, to protect countries and their borders from neighbors, from other sort of adversary states. It protected the countries back then in Europe when the Westphalian treaty was signed from any form of interference in their internal affairs. But as the world is changing, as sort of emerging technology comes online, such as what Julia mentioned regarding 3D printing, such as cryptocurrency, that Westphalian nation state is also becoming more digital, it's becoming more cyber. And these online challenges are also, can also be used and abused by the extremists that we're talking about, the extremists that we're monitoring, the people that seek to sow discord within society and between countries and to prevent peace between nations. I'd like to open the floor now for discussion and for any Q&As. We will have a collective discussion amongst everyone here, and I would really, really appreciate if anyone within the audience, and of course the speakers as well, were to provide any sort of advice to EMAN on where we should be really focusing in the future. what should be the key points that we should be focusing on? We've got a database that we're building, and that database requires many hours of work to try to find raw data that really supports the work that we're doing, credible information on certain individuals and organizations, but we're also wanting to build other things as well. So, please.
Thanks very much for this. Absolutely brilliant initiative. Thank you very much for the delicious lunch, which you missed out on. That's another matter.
Well, you can't tell. You've got something better
My question really goes to the core of the whole concept here. As someone who is often accused of being an extremist by people who think differently, accuse me of being an extremist for calling for lower levels of migration, not stopping immigration, lower levels. My question is, how do you determine what constitutes extremism? How will you determine what constitutes extremism?
I think that question applies to different countries very differently. I think when it comes to the UK, do you accept to be a British citizen? A proud British citizen who's also practicing, if you practice a faith, you practice it, but that doesn't contradict, nor does it clash with your patriotism towards Britain or towards the UK. So basically, and also, how do you view other people? How do you view the people that live in this country, all the different nationalities that live in this country, all the different religions that are practiced in this country? How do you view the laws of this country? Do you agree them or disagree with them? And if you do disagree with them, what levels what are you willing to do about it? And I think this is what it really comes down to. And I think there is a fine line between hate speech and extremism, and it is a conveyor, but it does lead towards that. And yes, there are many people that have come from across the world, refugees, for instance, that are coming to Britain, and they're not used to the life here. They're not used to the way things work here. But they don't necessarily come from extremist backgrounds. For instance, a lot of Syrians who left Syria, Syria was a very staunchly secular state. They cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood a very long time ago. So in Syria, just before the war in 2011, the very vast majority of people that left Syria were sort of secular, but practicing Muslims, but they weren't really radical. What radicalized them was the way the war panned out, the way the crisis erupted, and the brutalities on both sides. So my point is, some of these people, when they come to the UK, they may already have an idea of what it's like to live here amongst other people, amongst different people that you were that you were taught that these people are your enemies, or they're different to you, or they've bombed other countries, that they've bombed your country, or they were involved in invading other countries that you consider close to you. So I think that's a sort of, it's about talking to these people, listening to them, but also at the same time figuring out if they do have an ideology, where does that ideology come from? Is it a religiously extremist ideology? Because the vast majority of refugees that come here, they may be religiously inclined. To what extent, we're not sure.